Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder as I step out the door and deliver an episode to you while I walk the dog. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good morning, listeners. It's a lovely day here in suburban Chicago. And when I say lovely, I mean it's a little brisk, but very nice. The weather normally on a day like this would be, at this time of day, would be mid to high 70s, even the 80s, though that's more July. Instead, it's a brisk mid 60s with a nice breeze. So I'm actually wearing long sleeves, which is pretty nice. It's a beautiful day. It's the kind of weather I would expect in late September or early October. It's nice. Well, I thought I would I felt like doing a board game espresso triple shot today, just talking about some games, not having a big topic. And then I looked and I don't have a bunch of new games played that I haven't talked about at all on the podcast. But I looked back and I do have a couple games that I've played recently that I've never talked about on the podcast as in an episode where I'd sort of do a mini review. So I'm doing a sort of weird board game espresso, and I'll try to frame it a slightly different way as I do it. So here we go. It's a board game espresso triple shot. Latte machine, or espresso machine noise, espresso machine noise, espresso machine noise. For those of you new to the podcast, Board Game Espresso is an episode where I talk about games I've played recently for the first time, or in this case, a couple times, but not that deeply, and haven't talked about them on the podcast before. The general idea of these episodes is that I'm not doing a full deep dive review. Instead, I'm doing a light conversation about what the game is like to play and giving my initial impressions of it. For deep dive reviews, look for Message from the Deep episodes. The three games that I'm going to be talking about today, two of them I have played and talked about a little bit on the podcast before, but not in depth. So let's get started and we'll see what you think of these games. So the first game I want to talk about today is Cairn. Cairn is a two-player abstract game set around the theme of being, the game calls them shamans. I always feel a little weird about using that term because it is, I think, often used by colonists to describe priests from colonized civilizations, but that's the term the game uses. Think of it as wizards or whatever in some sort of magical past, and you are competing with one another to try and, set up rocks on the board. It is a extremely tactical game with a little bit of strategy, an aggressive amount of player versus player conflict, and really interesting think a couple moves ahead kind of gameplay. If you like Onitama, or on a larger scale, something like chess or Hive, these are the kinds of games Cairn sits comfortably in conversation with. The theme of Cairn, again, you have like these sort of mystical looking figures called shamans, and your opponent has the same, and you are moving them across a battlefield. In terms of look and feel of the game, it is very similar to Onitama. There are a limited number of moves that you can make. Whenever you make a move, they're depicted on these tiles. Whenever you make a move on a tile, you then flip the tile over, and there's a different move on the back. And so if you make a move, your opponent can't make that same move on their next turn because you have made that move. It's a grid of spaces, maybe 5 or 6 spaces wide. It's maybe 5 wide and 6 deep, something like that. And in the middle, there are these 2 stones called monoliths that are megaliths that have special powers on them. So on your turn, you're going to use one of the action tiles to move one of your pieces on the board, and then there's a couple different ways you could do that. And then if you end up with a shaman on one of the megaliths, then you can activate that megalith. Actually, I think you have to activate it. And no, you can usually skip it. I don't remember. But you activate the megalith, and then it alters the board in some additional way. There are always a couple megaliths off to the side, and those are available to be brought onto the board. So there are 2 ways to win the game. The first way, actually, there's one way to win the game. There's 2 ways to score points. The first person to, I think, 3 points wins the game. One way to score points is to get your figure into your opponent's camp. The thing is, the only way to score when you move into your opponent's camp is by using the jump tile. There are one of the movement tiles is a jump tile. It lets you jump over your piece or jump over an opponent's piece. And when you do that, if you jump off of the play space into your opponent's village, then you score a point. If you just move into your opponent's village using the move tile, you don't score the point. In fact, you just go back to the start, basically lose your piece off the board, which sometimes would be preferable to having your opponent capture your piece, but that's another story. The second way you can score a point is if you have an opponent on an empty space and you're able to capture them, or banish is the word, then you get to create a megalith in the spot that they were standing. When you create that megalith, you pick one of the two that are off to the side that aren't being used presently, although there's a whole bunch, so there's just two in play, and then you get a point. So the first 3 points wins. Cairn is a really interesting game. I find it very compelling. It puts me in the same mindset as something like Tash Kalar on the more complex end, or like I said, Onitama on the less complex end. You know, so I'm saying complex and not deep. These are very deep games. There's a lot going on, and you could be very good at planning way ahead, I suspect. So Cairn is an interesting game. It looks beautiful. It's got a really lovely art design and color palette, orange and blue interacting nicely. If you get a chance to try Cairn, I highly recommend it. You can play it over in Board Game Arena, which is where I've been playing it. So the thing that makes it different than other games I review on a Board Game Espresso episode is that I've actually played this several times now, but I played it on Board Game Arena. So it takes me a lot longer time to grasp the game. Now that might not be true if I play it live, but I very rarely play Board Game Arena games live. I usually play them not real time. So it's taken me a little bit longer. So you may have heard me discuss Cairn before. I've played it, but I only recently felt like I know it strong enough to talk about it here. Cairn is designed by Christian Martinez and with art by Vincent Joubert, or Joubert. It's Joubert. And it's published by Matagot, or Matagot. The second game I want to talk about fits in the same category. It's a game I played a couple times on Board Game Arena, but didn't really understand it. I tried to play it once in person, and I kind of learned enough to start, but I didn't really read the whole rulebook thoroughly, and it turns out Hadrian's Wall is the game I'm talking about, where you really need to understand the rulebook thoroughly in order to grasp everything that's happening. The systems are relatively uniform, and so once you understand the way that the information flows in Hadrian's Wall, it's relatively easy to understand how Section 2 works versus how Section 1 works, and so on. But overall, it is a game you have to understand before you can play well. So the first couple times I played it, I was kind of just clicking stuff. I didn't really understand what was going on. I finally did get it to the table. I sat down and played it on the table, on paper, and it worked a lot better. Like, I understood why everything worked the way it did, and it just went much more smoothly for me, and thus I felt pretty good about it. And thus I feel like I can talk about it with you now. So Hadrian's Wall is a complicated roll and write. I can't remember the term. The people at Motor City Gameworks, Matt Riddle and Ben Pinchback and Adam somebody, they have a term, complex roll and write or big roll and write or something like that, to describe games where there's a lot of overlapping and amplifying sort of sets of bonuses that you get as you check things off. And those games are really interesting. If you're trying to figure out what I mean, I'm talking about something like Fleet, the dice game, or Three Sisters are the two that I've played. I know they also have Motor City and recently French Quarter. I think after Three Sisters, I was sort of like, I like this a lot, but it's enough of it. I don't need another one or another two. Loaded roll and writes, that's what they call them, like loaded baked potato, I think. But Hadrian's Wall is in the same genre of the loaded roll and write. It does have a little bit of player interaction, but just a tiny bit. Mostly you're just competing for how many points did you get, how many points did the other players get. In Hadrian's Wall, you represent, I guess, Hadrian? One of Hadrian's people. You represent a prominent Roman person who is trying to help defend the British Isles for Rome against the Picts, and you do so by building up the Roman stuff in your thing. The game comes with 2 score pads, and you're going to put each score pad, you're going to take one sheet from each score pad and put them next to each other, so you have 2 score pads that you're working on. Unlike a lot of games, Hadrian's Wall does not have any dice at all. There's two randomized elements. You have a series of 12 building cards or diplomat cards, I don't remember what it calls them, 12 cards that are yours alone. And then there's a deck called the Fate deck. And this is the only randomized element for the game. So for the cards that you own, each round you're going to draw 2, and you pick one to be the extra resources you're going to get, and you pick the other to be the scoring condition that you're going to have available to you at the end of the game. Each round you do that, so at the end of the game you have 6 scoring cards that you can get points from. And most of the points, it varies from like 1 to 6 points maybe. I don't think there are very many cards where you can get more than 6 points. And the resources you can get are usually just 1 or 2 of a couple different resources that the game uses. The game uses 4 different colors of workers, and it uses these stone blocks. And so basically what you do is you get your resources for the round, and then you spend those resources in order to check boxes on your different sheets. And the boxes will then sometimes they'll give you bonuses that allow you to check other boxes, and over time you build up a system and a score. The game works really well. It's a really fun solo game, an interesting puzzle and challenge. I like it as a multiplayer game on Board Game Arena as well, because you kind of play it like a solo game, but there's a little bit of watching what other people are doing and you feed off of them a little bit. But it works really well as a solo game. I've actually kept it out with a plan to play it again when I have a half an hour here or there, because it's just so fun. It's really an interesting puzzle. Now, I imagine once you've played it half a dozen times or something, it'll lose some of that luster because the sheet is the same every time. So there's a bit of exploration where you're sort of like, well, what if I lean this way instead of that way? What if I explore this route instead of that route? But there's always a temptation once you get a really good score to just replicate that score or get as close, follow the same path again. And this is actually the problem I had with other loaded roll and writes like Three Sisters or Fleet the Dice Game, is that while there are some tactics involved in what you roll, generally it seems like there's a strategy, like it's all kind of the same. Hadrian's Wall is published by Garfield Games. Bobby Hill is the designer. The artist is Sam Phillips. I really enjoyed playing Hadrian's Wall, and I'm looking forward to playing it again. All right, the third game I'm going to now I'm going to do a dusty game. As you know, I usually pick one game that I played recently that I hadn't played in a long time, and I dust that game off, or talk about dusting that game off. This time it was A Handful of Stars. Now, I mentioned A Handful of Stars a couple episodes ago when I talked about betrayal in games, that I thought the challenge of a game where there's some negotiation and you might end up betraying somebody was an interesting challenge and made gameplay complex for me. So, A Handful of Stars is an area control game. It's not area control game. And so I guess it is just a, I walked one way around the house to avoid the dog barking at us. It turns out that dog has a fence on either side of the block, so they were able to come around the corner and bark at us anyway. So A Handful of Stars is not an area control game. I think of area control as contested spaces where you put different resources in, and the person who comes out on top gets points, but often there's secondary points for being the person who the second most control, that sort of thing. Porta Nigra, I talked about, is an area control game. In A Handful of Stars, each point on the board can only be held by one person at a time. So you do struggle for control of areas, but there is no blended control. Either you control it or you don't. I guess it still might be an area control game. I've heard people talk about it as a 4X game: explore, exploit, expand, and exterminate. I guess there's some of that there. That might be the best thing. It's built into a deck building game in the tradition of the Martin Wallace deck building games of the 2010s. So Martin Wallace created A Few Acres of Snow, A Study in Emerald, Mythotopia, and A Handful of Stars as 4 games. And I guess to a degree, Lincoln, though that one is a little different. But to a degree, all 3 of these are deck building games where you're acquiring areas, and when you acquire the area, you get the card that goes with the area, and then you use the resources on those cards to do other things in the game. And Wallace has a couple things that he does in his area control games that don't tend to get done in other ones. Particularly, he only lets you use one resource on each card instead of using all of them. And you generally can't you don't discard your hand at the end of the turn the way other deck builders have you do. So there's a bit more deliberation in when you use your cards and how you use your cards. So A Handful of Stars is really fun. I like A Studying Emerald better theme-wise, but I really like A Handful of Stars. I haven't gone back and played Mythotopia again for a while. I probably ought to before declaring that I like Handful of Stars second best out of the 4, but I like Handful of Stars second best out of the 4. The faction play is really fun. There's a lot of different stuff you can do with the cards. I like the way that the board control stuff works. The biggest challenge for me was that, as I maybe described in the last play, the feeling of fun at the table did not match the correct strategic point for me. That in order for me to play to win, I had to really go after the person who was in first place, but they were sort of on tilt when I started going after them, and I didn't go after them in the way I probably should have if I were playing really strategically. But in the end, it was a really fun and memorable game, with the exception of that part of it. So I don't know where the expectation setting would work better. Like, do I continue to play the way I have and try to get over myself in terms of feeling bad for attacking somebody in a game where you win by attacking somebody? Or do I set the expectations more clearly at the beginning, or during the game, make it more clear, like, yeah, this is a really cutthroat game, watch out? Or do I be more obvious in the way that I interact about, say, alliances? I mean, one of the things you could, if you watched our game carefully, and I'm being honest with myself here, you could interpret it as sort of allowed the other player to think we had an alliance. I didn't actively say I won't attack you, but I didn't actively discourage that view either, and then betrayed them, or surprised them at least. And that it's an interesting question for myself, like which part of it would be fun. And I don't know any of those strategies would be fun if the other person sort of gets really upset when I attack them. And the other question here is like just motives too. I was talking with another friend about this, and they're like, well, that other person, clearly one of the main motivators, one of the things that really drives them in the moment of the game is winning. And so that when they have an upset, they get upset for a bit. That doesn't mean they didn't have fun. And I would say by the end of the night, this person was clearly having fun again, but I also didn't keep attacking them. I'm not sure how much fun they would have had I gone after them, continued to go after them the way I strategically probably should have, because they were still in the lead after my sort of significant play. And the correct move, I think, strategically, would have been to keep attacking their places, because every time I took a planet away from them, I was raising my score and lowering theirs. Whereas anything else I did, like if I attacked any of the other players, I'm lowering one of the players who's not beating me and not gaining on the player who, I'm gaining a little bit, but not as much as I would had I gone after them more. So it's an interesting puzzle that maybe is a problem in my own head more than a problem in the game, but something to think about as I continue to play, because I really liked A Handful of Stars and I would like to play it again. So that's Martin Wallace. The artist is Odysseus Stenglu, publisher Tree Frog Games. I apologize for talking so much about that game. It's pretty hard to get a hold of. There was a really small print run, and I think most people who have it like it, so I don't know how much it circulates. So the last game I want to talk about here is Mythic Mischief. This is published by IV Studio, who have gone on to publish Moonrakers and at least one other game that's gotten a fair amount of buzz. Designed by Max Anderson, Zach Dixon, and Austin Harrison. I had a bit of a deja vu moment. I had a friend in high school named Austin Harrison who has gone on to work in Hollywood as an animator. And so it's weird to see someone named Austin Harrison. They're not the same person. I checked. The person I know doesn't live in Nashville, and this Austin Harrison does. So different Austin Harrison, but it was weird. The art is by Amin Farah and Halo Kazemi. Mythic Mischief is a really first off, if you are going to try to define the idea of overproduced, which I think is a problematic idea, because if you buy a product and you enjoy it to have a certain form factor, then I don't know how you can say it's overproduced. But if you're going to argue that games could be overproduced, Mythic Mischief, and I think a lot of the games from IV Studios maybe fit that profile. I got Mythic Mischief at Goodwill. Someone had given it away, and boy, was it a lucky find for us. I paid $3 for it, and I believe, if I am reading the Kickstarter right, it was a $95 game. And I'm not sure I would pay $95 for it, but boy, it was fun. Mythic Mischief is a squad-based tactical skirmish game in which you have a group of kids, magical kids. There's like Frankensteins and Draculas and ghosts and whatnot, and zombies. And you're hiding out in the mystical library at your school. Think sort of Hogwarts, but for monsters. And you aren't supposed to be in there. And so there's a librarian that the kids call the Tome Keeper, who's wandering around in the library. And if he catches you in there, he sends you back to your dorm, and your team, the other team, the team who basically tricked you into getting caught by the Tome Keeper, gets a point. First team to 10-point wins. What makes Mythic Mischief interesting is that each team, each squad, has a set of 4 actions that are all very similar, but not identical. 2 of them are identical. The move action that everyone can take is identical. And there's another action that everyone can take, I don't recall right now. But then everyone else has 2 unique actions that are slightly different. There's one action that allows you to move an opponent, and there's one action that does something else. Rearrange the bookshelves in the library. And then each team also has an epic maneuver that you can do once, and then you can recharge to do again later. So during the game, you take turns manipulating the setup of the board with the goal of getting as many of your opponent's figures into the way of the Tome Keeper as you can, and then the team that does that the best is going to win, because the Tome Keeper you'll get 10 points. And the Tome Keeper has a set path that they're going to walk in the library, although you can change that by moving the bookshelves around. This game is pretty fun. I think if you get a chance to play it, you definitely should. It's a really interesting tactical game. It's maybe a little bit more complex than it needs to be for the level of game it is, in terms of how long it's going to take, how deep the strategy is, but it is pretty cool, and I really enjoyed playing it the couple times my son and I and his cousins played the game. He definitely really liked it and asked me to definitely keep it, so I'm sure it'll come up again. You'll see me talking about having played it or whatever in future, but it's really fun. We also did end up with the Headmaster box, which is the sort of deluxe edition, meaning that we got 3 more factions than you would get if you just have the base set, which is nice because I think the game lives in its variety. I think if you get stuck with one set of factions, it's probably not as good as you were hoping it would be. And so that is probably the challenge of the game Mythic Mischief. Like I said, a fun game. I'm happy to have it, gonna keep it, gonna play it some more. And that's what I have to say about that. Well, thanks for joining me on my walk today. I hope that your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye. Where is the paper? Okay, I definitely put it in my pocket. What the heck? Oh, here it is.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.